Russian mercenaries claim they've gained new ground in Bakhmut, now a flashpoint in Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky tells me his forces are vowing to stand strong, even as they acknowledge the Russians are advancing on the embattled city. A new clip of my exclusive Zelensky interview is just ahead. But first, to the war zone. CNN's Melissa Bell has the latest on the battle for Bakhmut.
Bakhmut, now a byword for horror and death. Before the war, Bakhmut was about life. Its sculpted hedges and rose gardens regularly Instagrammed. A picture of peace. And one of the oldest cities in the Donbass, its genteel facades built on the prosperity of salt mines. Marina Zvania is the fourth generation of her family born and raised in the city. Now she and the pupils she taught have had to flee. Her life, she says, lies in ruins, like the old theatre in which she had her wedding photos taken.
They started by destroying the buildings that would be hardest to rebuild, the priceless historical heritage of our city, because I think they want to erase our nation.
A history celebrated only recently for the 450th anniversary of the founding of Bakhmut. Its grand buildings, proud reminders of better times. 7 months of Russian artillery have pulverized it, driving more than 90% of its people out, and those left to the edge of sanity.
It's not living, it's surviving. People can get used to the living without heating, water. You can never get used to explosions.
Before the war, Bakhmut was famous for the winery built in its salt mines and for its bubbles. A tourist attraction, now plundered by Evgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary group. His men closing in on the center of the city and making it harder for civilians to get in and out. This is the so-called Road of Life, one of the last arteries into the town's center, bogged down and muddy, usable only now by armored vehicles. Home in Bakhmut is no more. The view from above, from heaven to hell.
How would you describe what's been lost?
It's as if my heart has been pulled out and thrown away, and I'm trying to pick up the pieces and put it together again. I don't know how else to describe it. Absolutely everything is lost.
And soon, most likely, in Russian hands.
It was, Wolf, a town of some 70,000 people. Now most of them have gone. And whilst they're beginning to come to terms with the loss of their city, the fight goes on. We've seen tonight one of Ukraine's top generals making his third visit in less than a week to Bakhmut, suggesting that for the optics at least, Ukraine is keen to show that it continues to fight street by street for some sort of, not quite victory, but holding out. This is no longer really a city they're fighting over. As you've seen, it's essentially been turned to rubble. What the Ukrainians are fighting for, Wolf, is time, continuing to degrade the Russian war machine, and specifically Evgeny Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries that have been so instrumental in making progress in Bakhmut, to prevent the Russians from any further large offensive attacks once they get beyond it, and also giving them time to build up their own forces with the Western equipment that's due to arrive for the counter-offensive that we understand is due to start this spring, Wolf.
Horrible situation indeed. Melissa Bell, thank you very much for that report. Let's map out the challenges Ukrainian forces are facing in Bakhmut and in the broader war. CNN's Brian Todd is over at the Magic Wall, along with retired U.S. Army Colonel and CNN military analyst Cedric Leighton. Brian?
Wolf, as we look tonight at the battle for the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, critical phase in that battle right now, we're going to talk to Colonel Leighton here about the munitions being used. CNN doing recent reporting, Colonel Leighton, that the Ukrainians are burning through ammunition faster than the U.S. can provide it. Things like the Javelin anti-tank guided missile system, the Stinger portable air defense system, and artillery shells. What kind of a difference is that making on the battlefield that the Ukrainians are burning through this stuff faster than the Americans and the NATO allies can send it over there?
So, Brian, both the Javelin and the Stinger are highly effective weapons, but the minute that they lose them, the minute that they don't have access to them anymore, that means that the Ukrainians then are much more equal to the Russians in terms of manpower and in terms of their ability to actually fight the war. So when you see like a Javelin, the anti-tank guided missile system, highly effective shoulder-fired weapon that can really have an impact even if you don't have tanks. tanks, it can kill the other side's tanks. When you go to the Stinger missiles, you've got an anti-aircraft system that any person can basically carry on their back and fire a missile that can kill a lot of aircraft. But if you don't have it, you can't do that, and you lose any advantage you would have that way.
All right, let's talk about another dynamic in Bakhmut. Wagner. Western officials saying that Wagner, the mercenary fighting force from Russia, running out of recruits from prisons, convicts, to throw at the Ukrainian forces. They've been losing just massive amounts of casualties there in Bakhmut and elsewhere. Is Bakhmut Wagner's last stand?
It could be, and the reason that it might be is because, just like you said, Brian, they're losing a lot of personnel, they're losing weapons, they're running through ammunition as well, just like the Ukrainians are, and it's very likely that they're kind of at the end of their supply line, both in terms of personnel and in terms of weapons.
Okay, another question of munitions, F-16 fighter jets. CNN doing some reporting, citing sources briefed on the matter, that 2 Ukrainian pilots are in the United States, not training on F-16 specifically, but being evaluated on how long it will take them to train on planes like F-16s. Will that make a huge difference on the battlefield if the United States sends F-16s to Ukraine?
If the Ukrainians are trained appropriately, just like American pilots would be on the F-16, it could make a huge difference. Now, it's not going to be the end-all and be-all, but in a tactical sense, for a battle like Bakhmut, it could make a huge difference because it could provide them with the air superiority, the localized air superiority that they would need, the Ukrainians would need, in order to actually win that battle.
All right, Colonel, thank you very much. Wolf, Colonel Leighton and other military experts telling us that the battle for Bakhmut, the city not of great strategic import to either side, but that the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting so hard for that city, maybe in order to deplete the other side of forces that it could use fighting elsewhere. Wolf?
All right, Brian Todd and Colonel Cedric Leighton, guys, thank you very, very much. Now to my exclusive interview with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. I asked him about U.S. aid to Ukraine and Republican skepticism about spending more to arm and assist his country. Listen. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the House of Representatives here in Washington, Kevin McCarthy says he supports Ukraine, but doesn't support what he calls a blank check for Ukraine. That criticism is being echoed by former President Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, possible leading contenders for the Republican presidential nomination. How worried are you, President Zelensky? How worried are you about this trend among some Republicans that it could threaten the flow of support to Ukraine?
Firstly, I would like to thank the bipartisan support of Ukraine. It's very important. Recently, I had a meeting with the representatives of the Republican Party, and I'm thankful to a congressman who visited Ukraine. They told me that they want to support Ukraine very much like the Democrats. We don't want to slow down. We have a different approach. We want to give more and now, but not dragging it forever. That was their signal. We don't care about the support, the sign of support, as long as it's powerful and constant. I think that Speaker McCarthy, he never visited Kyiv or Ukraine, and I think it would help him with his position. When you come to us, when both Democrats and Republicans come to us, they see the supply routes, every shell, every bullet, every dollar, Mr. McCarthy. He has to come here to see how we work, what's happening here, what war caused us, which people are fighting now, who fighting now, and then after that, make your assumptions.
We're also going to touch upon some broader topics like the G20 summit that happened in New Delhi. And of course, we're going to speak about the expiration of the current grain deal, about the export of grain from Ukraine and what the stakes now are. Are there any chances to prolong that, and so on?
Okay, so let's first discuss with touch upon the ammunition topic and Ukrainian preparations. What are your analysis? What is going on in this respect? Because we understand that something is going to happen in spring. Ukraine is actually expecting the change of the weather. Right now, the fierce fight around Bakhmut are actually aimed at exhausting the Russian potential, the Russian offensive potential, and there are different interpretations of what is going on. Some people say that Russia is trying to exhaust Ukraine. Other people are saying that Ukraine is trying to exhaust Russia to prepare its counteroffensive. So, of course, Ukraine is waiting now for armaments and ammunitions to arrive within probably several weeks, within several months, to be ready in April and May to launch counteroffensive. But what is the situation with the preparation and with the international context?
Well, first of all, it should be reminded what kind of weapons we have in the battlefield, because in addition to the Soviet-type weapons that were inherited and the production of which was inherited by Ukraine after the independence, we also have a big amount, maybe that is even the majority of what we have, of weapons delivered by Western partners, and those are weapons of NATO standards. So we have a problem with ammunition to both types, because when it comes to the Soviet type weapons, we cannot effectively produce them because our military industry, as so many other different industries in Ukraine, is under the risk of constant attacks by Russia. So we need to scramble around the world, sometimes among not so obvious partners, for them to supply us that ammunition. A couple of episodes back, we talked about how Pakistan supplied us, reportedly, crates with ammunition for our, I think that it was machine guns, but also the 152 millimeter howitzers. Now, when it comes to NATO, the NATO type weapons, the problem here is that the capacities that NATO countries have during the peacetime, and this is the peacetime for NATO, NATO is not in a war, those capacities are insufficient to catch up with the needs of Ukraine. NATO cannot produce as much 155 millimeter caliber ammunition as Ukraine needs, which is why the discussion that is now being led in the West, and this is the effort led by the European Union, who coordinates the efforts primarily by the EU member states, is to take the weapons that already are at warehouses, that already are stockpiled among the NATO states, and to deliver them to Ukraine, and then to launch production to replenish the NATO member states' stockpiles. Because if we go in for production of ammunition for Ukraine specifically and wait that long, this poses a major risk for how it is going to go in the battlefield.
Right. At the same time, there is a problem of Russian supplies and Russian production, and we have discussed, of course, the role of China in eventually helping Russia. But from what we can judge, that Russian missile attacks have become much more rare in the past weeks, and it seems that there is also not a big stock of missiles. Russians started in October from 70, 80, 100 missiles per launch. Now the quantities are much more modest. Also, the questions about tanks. There is information that Russia might be going to take the older tanks, T-62, I think it's called, right? Which are actually very, very old right now. They are 50, 60 years old. So, of course, we should understand that why I'm saying that is that Russia is also exhausting its resources. And it's not like NATO is helping or international partners are helping Ukraine against the infinitely bigger enemy which has a limited number of resources. What we might judge from is that the situation on the front line also has a big ammunition ammunition, what we call ammunition hunger, or ammunition hunger on the Russian side as well. What else? Ukrainian pilots also went to the United States, and this, of course, is a question whether Ukraine will get fighter jets. What we can say about it?
Well, the information about this is so far limited, but nonetheless quite inspiring, even though modestly at this point, but still. So the information basically is that only as little as 2 Ukrainian pilots have traveled to the United States. They reportedly are undergoing skills evaluation in Arizona. And because of how little official information we have, we cannot really judge what is the bigger picture here. But presumably, the United States want to see what the skills of Ukrainian pilots are generally, using the example of these 2 pilots that have already traveled, to see if indeed it is not such a big leap to provide Ukraine with fighter jets of the Western standard. So basically, the US wants to make sure, presumably, if this transfer would be doable and whether it would be worth the cost, so to say. So at least for now, even though everything is so clandestine, at least for now, the good news is that the process is ongoing, that the story has not been shut down, because there have been different waves of attention, of public and media attention, to whether or not we're going to receive these F-16 fighter jets or any other Western fighter jets. And so at least we know that the story is still being entertained, and that is a good thing for Ukraine.
Yeah, this is something that we have discussed previously, that there are red lines, which are actually not red lines, maybe they are rosy lines or something like that, because they are being crossed, fortunately, and it's very important that they continue to being crossed. Remember that initially, at the initial stages of the war, there was no talk about fighter jets, there's no talk about air defense systems, there was no talk about long-range missiles or such systems as Patriot, anti-air defense systems, or such systems as HIMARS, and they gradually started to come to Ukraine. Well, we should remember then back in, let's say, 2015, 2016, 2017, there was no talk about javelins. Mm-hmm. Remember how javelins were enthusiastically perceived, welcomed in Ukraine. I think it was already in 2021 when it was clear that Russia is preparing something. There was news that javelins are coming, and how big news it was for Ukrainians. Now we understand that javelins is actually a tool, very important tool for the infantry, of course, to target Russian tanks, and they're extremely efficient, because Ukrainians, for our understanding, Ukrainians destroy over 100 of Russian tanks per month. And the total number of the destroyed tanks is well before 1,000. And it's good because Russian capacity to produce tanks is not that big. Actually, experts estimated around 20-30 tanks per month. So Ukrainians are actually destroying more tanks per month than Russians are able to produce, and this destruction is also linked to the weapons, starting from javelins and Lavs, and of course going farther and farther. There was also the news recently by the Polish side that new Patriot systems are arriving into Ukraine, and the first Leopard 2 tanks are arriving into Ukraine from Poland, and this is of course the good news. But the question is about quantity, of course, and the question about fighter jets. Let's not forget that pilot is one thing, but the maintenance, all the logistics is a very complicated story, and there are dozens and dozens of people who need to work on each particular fighter jets, and of course the question of maintenance and repair. I hope all these questions are now being discussed. Let's talk about big politics. There was a G20 meeting in New Delhi. Was it good for Ukraine? Seems not so good, because Ukraine was not that present on the summit.
Well, yes. So the issue of Russia's war against Ukraine was specifically on the agenda, and it was discussed. But first of all, for the second summit in a row, the final statement of the summit did not include any unanimity on any unanimous wording or any unanimous condemnation of what is going on. And while it may not be a surprise that Russia was against, as being part of the G20, was against the wording that, any wording about being a perpetrator, it is not so well also that Russia was not the only one to be against that unanimity in final conclusions, because there was also China, who consistently does not support such kind of statements, as we have many times discussed in this podcast. So this lack of unanimity of G20 is something that is a sour pill for Ukraine in the sense, and because of the what countries make part of the G20, because we're talking about also India, China, but also Brazil, Argentina, South Africa. And this also brings me to my next point, which is the absence of Ukraine at this summit, of a powerful representation consistent with the one that was during the previous summit in Indonesia, when President Zelensky had the chance to not only just to deliver his address, as he does on many occasions, but also to present his peace formula, the 10-step peace formula. This time, Ukraine was not any comparably visible during the summit, and I think we should have been there because, again, of which economies are represented there. It's not only about the quantity, about the 80 or 90% of the world GDP being present in the G20, but also that specifically many of those member states are representatives of the global South. And that is something that has been a consistent story, a consistent narrative in media around the world, I think, about how and why the global South is, well, it's not reluctant to support Ukraine per se, but it's quite indifferent about what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine needs the support of more countries from that group of countries. And I think in that sense, unfortunately, sorry for my being blunt here, but this may have been an opportunity wasted here.
Yeah, but interestingly, what were the reasons for that? The presence of Russia? Why there was a decision to take Russia and not Ukraine?
I don't think that Ukraine can afford seeing the world that black and white every time there Russia somewhere, across the table. Why then I was two members of the UN, when we have been pushing for the exclusion of Russia from the Security Council, for example, it is not happening. It has not happened in the last month of Ukraine's campaign for that. So why am I not leaving the UN? There is an extent until which it is reasonable to go in these things, but not to participate just because there is Russia. Russia will always be there, even if Russia disintegrates, which I don't believe, but so many like to speak about that. Even if that happens, in one form or another, there will be a Moscow-based government, and everybody in the world will deem it necessary to talk to them because they are a center of something, of an entity, of a geopolitical entity. So I don't think this is the approach we should be taking.
I think that we should be taking an approach to exclude Russia from everywhere, and including from the UN Security Council and including from G20. And this is also the question for our diplomacy, why Russia is still invited to that. Well, we have seen the Lavrov saying that Russia was actually invaded, Russia was attacked, and the reaction in the hall was not very pleasant maybe for Lavrov, but he keeps talking these points that it is not Russia who started the war, it is somebody else who started the war with the help of Ukrainians, all this crap that Russian propaganda is actually spreading. Okay, what else? What happened next? Prolongation of the grain deal. Why is it important?
Well, it has not happened yet, but the reason why we're talking about that, because it is about the current grain deal is about to expire, and Russia is trying to turn this these negotiations about the prolongation like a bargaining game, because the original Green Deal was launched in summer, then it was prolonged, I think, in October, November, I think. And now when a new iteration is due, Russia is saying, let's play a fair game here, and otherwise we're not going to support the prolongation of the Green Deal. And what Russia sees as a fair game, what Russia tries to achieve here is to, as it says, as it presents it, to create equal conditions, not only for the export of Ukrainian grain, but also for the export of Russia's agricultural products. And this is a gray area we're coming in here, because there are no international sanctions, not EU sanctions, for instance, that are targeting Russia's agricultural sector. It has been a consistent policy of the European Union, for instance, that we're not going to put sanctions against something that can endanger global food security. But Russia is trying to present this as not just about the agricultural product per se, but also about the logistical chains and about the payment methods. They're trying to say that, okay, we have our grain, but we cannot use some routes, some ships, we cannot use many banks that have been excluded from SWIFT, for instance, under different rounds of sanctions, to deliver that grain to different regions of the world. So, but the problem is that if sanctions are lifted from Russia, for instance, when it comes to that SWIFT exclusion, Russia is once again going to benefit from trading with the world in other areas. So the reasons and the effect for which Russia was punished, basically, being excluded from SWIFT. But now that punishment will, just go out. So Russia is trying to achieve several things here, just showing that, okay, we're fighting for equal agricultural export, but there is so much for Russia to gain alongside with that. So this is a shady game Russia is playing.